This is a session on the future of land and whether or not land is going to become one of the key strategic resources of the future. And I think it was Mark Twain who said, buy land, they're not making it anymore. And when you look at how the world's land, available land, habitable land is used, you see that we have about 10.4 billion hectares of land available. And most of that is already being used. But then when you look at estimates for how demands on land are going to increase in the future, the picture starts to become quite alarming. So this is just based on a simple literature review that we did recently at Chatham House, and you can see these light blue additions to the land use there underneath. If yields, agricultural yields, continue to grow sluggishly at a little under 1%, and demand for food increases as economists expect it to by 2050, we could be looking at something in the region of another billion hectares of land being necessary. We need more land for urban expansion. That typically occurs at the expense of some of the most productive farmland available, and so there's a multiplier effect. You need more land for food production than you're giving up for urbanization. What a lot of people don't realize is that we need a lot of land if we're going to achieve the Paris Agreement's goals of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Not only do we have to decarbonize the energy system, we actually have to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and either put it underground or lock it up in trees and biomass. And that means potentially planting a lot more trees, afforestation and reforestation there, and using a lot of bioenergy in our energy systems. All of these things require a huge amount of land. If we want to get off plastics, which a lot of governments and international NGOs want us to do at the moment, and for good reasons, then what are the biomaterials that we're going to use to replace those plastics? They're going to require crops, they're going to require land. When you add all of these things up, you come to the conclusion that we need something in the region of another 9 Indias worth of land. When I talk to people about how much land we have available and how much more land we need, the common currency of additional land is an entire India. And what the 9 Indias add up to, roughly in terms of land mass, it's about an Africa. It's about an entire continent of additional land that could be necessary. So I put it to the panel that we have here that pressures on land may amount to an unsustainable level of demand. And we have a fantastic set of experts to discuss the challenges that this creates with us. We have immediately to my left, Dr. Jimé Adoum, who is the Executive Secretary of SILS, a regional intergovernmental organization that deals with droughts in the Western Sahel region, and previously a Minister of Agriculture in Chad. Then we have Lisa Johnson from Colombia, a lawyer by training, but a specialist in investment and trade regimes, in particular in relation to the land sector. Then we have Professor Tim Benton of the University of Leeds and a distinguished fellow at Chatham House, who has previously been the UK's global food security champion and has worked with the G20 and other governments on issues pertaining to land use, biodiversity and food security. After that, we have Isha Judge Aluwalia from India, a macroeconomist by profession, a public policy expert, and currently involved in a lot of work on urbanization there and the land use issues that throws up. And then finally, at the end, Olav Tjorven of the EAT Initiative, but with a previous background within the UN system. So, I'm going to go, first of all, I think, to you, Tim Benton. What are the implications, potentially, of these mounting pressures for global land?
Well, thanks very much, Rob. My background is in ecology, hence the biodiversity tie. And one of the reasons that I became interested in food and land originally was because agriculture is the biggest pressure on unsustainable land use and the biggest pressure on biodiversity and a whole range of other things. And actually, when you look at the food system as a whole, it is completely unsustainable however you choose to define sustainability, whether it's from a health perspective or whether it's from an environmental perspective. And the costs of the environmental degradation and the healthcare costs of poor diet amount to about somewhere around 10 times the total global agricultural economy. And on top of that, the global agricultural economy is incredibly inefficient at turning turning agricultural production into healthy people. And I think there is a very strong argument, and I'm sure Elif will come back to it, around how we should change our diets from a health perspective, but certainly from an environmental perspective. When you think about air quality and the amount of water that agriculture uses and the amount of biodiversity it impacts and all of those other things, it is criminal that we do all of that for a food system which is, depending on how you calculate it, between 10 and 40% efficient. The rest is overproduced, overconsumed because it's so cheap, and thrown away. So I term this that we're kind of stuck in a vicious cycle, and the future has got to be breaking out of that vicious cycle. And the reason I call it a vicious cycle is that we have focused on agricultural productivity since the Second World War, effectively, focusing on growing ever more, although recently we talk about doing it more sustainably. This has driven down the price of food, it's increased the availability of food, it becomes economically rational to waste food. Food is freely available, so most of us overeat food, to the tune of 20 or 30% more calories on a daily basis than we need. The intensification of agriculture and this overproduction of food that we throw away drives climate change. 30% of greenhouse gases are associated with food these days. That climate change impacts on yield, so we need to have a greater intensification and a greater land area if we're going to produce the same amount of food. That impact on climate change also creates a greater need for land for carbon mitigation, biomass energy, carbon capture and storage, and so on, and it drives this whole increase in competition for land, all in the name of this highly wasteful agricultural food system. So we can imagine contrasting that with a focus, instead of on agricultural productivity growth, focusing on making the food system efficient, healthy people fed sustainably per unit input instead of yield per unit input. We would need to grow vastly different things, because at the moment we produce 3 times more cereals than we need from a human nutrition perspective, and a third the amount of fruit and vegetables. We'd need to grow different things. That would imply a more diversified agriculture. If we were focusing on a food system that was efficient, we'd have less waste. Those two things together would allow us to free up land, so reducing land pressure. That would allow climate mitigation. So we could imagine a situation where we had a more diversified agriculture, completely different structure to the global food system, ending up with healthier people, less land pressure, and a better climate. And that would be a virtuous circle. And as I go around the world talking to governments about this sort of thing, very few people say, no, we wouldn't want to be there. The issue then becomes, how do we actually get there, rather than the recognition that where we all are at the moment, that our food system is unsustainable for health and environmental reasons. And there are lots of levers that can be pulled, and I'll just finish here with, it feels to me like we are with food as we were with smoking 40 years ago. And if you think about the path to smoking, we've had public awareness, we've had education campaigns, we've had sin taxes, we've had public bans, we've had restrictions, we've had a whole variety of different routes, including technological innovation with vaping and nicotine patches and so on. And I think if we're going to transform the food system to free up land to reduce this land pressure, then we're going to have to go through another long, similar journey of decades, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I'm going to turn now to, I think, to you, Olav, because of course EAT is really at the forefront of trying to effect a shift of the kind that Tim's talking about.
Well, thank you. And Tim, can we hire you? I mean, you just stole my thunder, but thank you for that, making my job easier within the 3 minutes. You know, it's just a striking statistic. Livestock takes up some 80% almost, or around 80% of available agricultural lands in our world. They provide a bit below 20% of the calories we eat. And when you factor in that this gets to the point that you mentioned about a system that is off the rails and very inefficient in many ways, that this is a key driver of climate change, a key driver of loss of biodiversity, and a key driver of non-communicable diseases. And with all the issues we now see exploding around the world because of the junk food epidemic, it's very clear that we have a huge challenge here, but also a huge opportunity. And I think when it comes to the issue of land, which of course is fraught with all kinds of politics and all kinds of interests, the lens of looking at the challenge of land through the lens of food and food systems, I think is potentially a very powerful one. And we certainly feel in EAT that this is now helping to bring a broad range of actors around the table that haven't before really spoken to each other. You have the health community, of course the environmental community, you have the agriculture and nutrition communities, you have the chefs, you have the mayors, you have the smallholder farmers. Actually now talking, and really recognizing that we do have a food system that we desperately need to take serious action on if we are to bend all the curves and all the trends that are currently going in the wrong direction. And we, what's incredibly important is that we have to stop just kind of assuming that trends will continue into the future and just kind of work on the basis of incrementalism, because that is going to lead, it's going to lead to the train wreck down the road that we all worry about. We have to get used to the idea that we need transformation. We need serious change in business practices and in policies at all levels to be able to actually avoid what we're currently steering towards.
Make that tangible for us. So if you had to name kind of 3 things that need to happen for this transformation of the food system to take place, what would you want to see?
Oh, I mean, we certainly need to address the kind of the food loss and waste issues. We're wasting 30 to 40% of the food before it even gets to any plate. Of course, also a lot of loss in the household. There is the whole protein issue. I mentioned livestock, and we need to get used to the idea that the future is much more plant-based than animal protein-based. Doesn't mean we're not vegans, we're not vegetarians as such, but we need to understand that shift is necessary, just as we have all understood, although we still lack a lot of action to happen. We all understood that the future of energy needs to be alternative energy and clean energy. The same thing has to happen when it comes to food and the role of plants versus animals.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, but just to note actually, the slide above, about 80% of global agricultural land is used by the livestock sector, whether that's as pasture or growing crops to feed to the animals. So there's a big potential shift that can occur there, I think. Let's come to the issue of trade and interdependency between countries, because I can imagine the economists in the room muttering to themselves that if we just trade, we can allocate land effectively and a lot of these pressures can be relieved. Is that your sense of the issue, Lisa?
That would be nice, actually. But I do think that, as with many the other sessions over the past couple of days, we've heard about how globalization and trade presents both opportunities and challenges for addressing some of the issues that we're talking about. Same with trade. So you could think about, for example, in looking at how much water or land is embedded in a particular product and treating that like a carbon footprint type approach. So when you're trading food products, you understand how much water, how much land is embedded in those products, and you then use that knowledge for your consumer choices or for your policy choices. So you could think about innovative ways of understanding the land, the water, the biodiversity inputs into your food, or the opportunity cost for that food, and make your consumer choices and regulatory choices on that basis. But I think another aspect of global governance on economic policy that's relevant is also international governance of capital flows. So movement of investment across borders is also an important aspect of globalization that is part of trade agreements, and it also needs to be discussed. So if we think about increasingly, governments are committing in trade treaties to allow free flow of capital across borders and investment in all types of sectors and activities. Sometimes governments put restrictions on the types of investment they permit, oftentimes they don't. So you could, for example, in your trade agreement, commit to allow foreign investors to invest in agriculture, in real estate, in mining subsurface minerals that then impact on the surface use of land. A lot of cross-border investment is now in infrastructure, which has important implications for land use as well. One thing that I want to highlight about the governance of international investment, especially when it comes to land, is that by design, the governance of disputes regarding international investment are very different from the governance of disputes relating to international trade. So international trade is something that's resolved at a state-to-state level, but with international investment and disputes relating to that, so disputes relating to land policy, how that policy is applied and how that policy is shaped, those disputes are purposefully delocalized. So the idea is that if an investor challenges or seeks to challenge the way that a land use regulation or law has been designed or applied, that you don't necessarily need to go through the local court or local system. You go to a delocalized, decentralized international body, and international kind of private adjudicators make that decision. And it's also meant to take that dispute out of the geopolitical context. So you're supposed to remove the states from that dispute as well. So it's very different from the trade context, in that states are removed, domestic contexts are removed. And I think when we're thinking about land, that's incredibly important, because with land, it's a very localized resource, and it's also at the heart of so many geopolitical issues. So trying to understand how we tackle some of the governance challenges that we need to tackle in order to use land more efficiently and tackle all of these challenges relating to sustainable development. How do we do that when the key international economic framework now specifically is designed to remove some of those sensitive questions from a local context or from even a state-to-state context?
Thank you. Just one last slide, actually. This is from a Chatham House website, resourcetrade.earth, where we've actually shown trade in embedded land in agricultural commodities among the 10 biggest exporters and importing countries. And just to pull out a couple of key points from this, there are essentially two major exporters of embedded land, two, if you like, land superpowers, and they are South America and North America. That is what these are the regions which are essentially feeding the world through trade in embedded land. On the import side of things, you can see China, a very big importer. China has a lot of land, but it's not very productive, and they have a large population, of course. And a growing region of export is the Black Sea region, Russia and Ukraine, that you can see there at the bottom on the left-hand side, a growing breadbasket region. So just in terms of extrapolating these sorts of things forwards in the context of the trade disputes that we're seeing today, you can imagine that potentially agricultural commodities could become more of an element of statecraft and geopolitical influence, particularly, I suppose, as fossil fuels start to exit the energy system. Jimé, let's turn to you now. West Africa, the Sahel, kind of on the front line, if you like, of some of these issues of land degradation, climate change, water scarcity. How do you see this issue?
Oh, thank you, Tom. I would want to seize this opportunity to thank Chatham House for having deployed a lot of energy and resources to make me come to this conference. And so really, I do sincerely appreciate that. Second thing is, for 1 minute, I'll tell you where I come from I mean, the organization for which I'm the executive secretary has been created back in 1973 following severe drought that decimated Sahel and West Africa, livestock and people death. And we've been in business, I mean, the organization has been in business for 45 years. It covers the 17 countries for both ECOWAS, UMO, and SEALs, roughly 365 million inhabitants. And the region possesses the highest growth rate in the world. With respect to land, there is land. But the policies of the land have been so skewed to such an extent that we have not really organized dialogues around which policies will be designed and implemented. Luckily, though, with the population pressure, there is no more luxury to ignore the land issues and land tenure issues, particularly with respect to the new drivers, the conflicts and migration and what have you. So with respect to degraded land, the agency for which I'm working and has been in the business to deal with climate change, land degradation, water-related issues, has developed a slew of techniques, technologies that could be actually used to reclaim degraded land. And with the help of USAID and USGS, recently we undertook a 15-year series of studies that demonstrated, yes, the land has been degraded, but then a series of land strips have also been recuperated, and we know how to bring it into production with respect to using water technologies, the drip irrigation, what have you. In a nutshell, we want all of you to, and over there, if we don't take care of the business, and Africa has 1.2 billion people, of which that region from which I come actually occupies 30%. And it's very dynamic, but it's also experiencing severe heartburn nowadays with respect to a variable that has never been in the business. Now security comes in and really complicate matters. And so when security becomes an issue, people are kicked out of their terroir, as we say. They go to new areas, they add more pressure, and the land carrying capacity of where people are newly arrived becomes insufficient. And so we have a lot of issues. And so luckily, we can no longer avoid discussing the land tenure, bringing it into production. And so we invite you, policymakers, thinkers, NGOs, come over there, sit down with us. We're going to bring a lot of pressure, and we're going to change. It's feasible. I'm going to stop here for now, and I'll come back to some of the questions later.
Fascinating. I think it's very interesting that you made the link between land management, land governance on the one hand, and then security and human movement and migration on the other, because I think that raises some interesting questions about what the future may look like if we have to find another Africa's worth of land from our back pockets. Our final speaker, Isha, would you like to share some perspectives from the work that you've been doing in India?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. This is my first time at the Chatham House London conference, and I've certainly enjoyed it very much. I'm going to give a slightly different perspective from my neighbors. Coming from where I do in India, we really look at water as the strategic resource for the next decade. On current projections, if business as usual continues in India, the available water will meet only half the demand for water by 2030. So that tells you, how much water weighs in our planning for development ahead. 80% of our water is used in agriculture, and the water use efficiency is 30%. compared with 50 to 60% for Israel or Taiwan. So essentially, we have a long way to go to improve agricultural productivity if we can only use our water more efficiently and also other inputs like fertilizer more efficiently. Also, because we underprice water, we end up giving the wrong signals, and farmers are producing water-intensive crops in areas that are water stressed. So with given technologies, if we can get our policies on pricing and water use right, we can go a long way in improving our agricultural productivity. However, the burden of our food economy on the environment is much lower than of the industrialized countries. India is the least meat-eating country in the world. And even with rapid growth in the last 20 years and people's incomes rising, what we have found is that Indians seem to love chicken and not meat or beef. Well, for religious, cultural, whatever, preferences. So we've had an increase in chicken consumption, where 8% of the population had chicken in 1994. Today it's 38%. But that again imposes less burden in terms of feed, land necessary to grow the feedstock. You mentioned about the wastage of food. In the industrialized world, the wastage happens at the consumer end. In developing countries like India, wastage happens because we do not have enough investment in logistics for storage, refrigeration, transportation. And that, again, is something which has an economic solution to it. This problem is going to get worse in the years ahead as urbanization is gathering momentum. In urban areas, again, water seems to be a large issue in our development planning but that is due to our own fault that we have not invested in water and sanitation. As a result, because we underprice water in urban areas as well, we are not able to reach water to people's homes, and also when we do that, the water is contaminated because we have not invested in sewage treatment, in drainage, etc. The pressure on land in our type of countries comes really from urban areas in two major ways. When you have unplanned urbanization, you have encroachments on water bodies, loss of biodiversity, you have urban sprawl rather than planning of compact cities. All of that leaves its burden on land. And one area which is extremely important in terms of its impact on land is our inability to manage our solid waste. Because we do not segregate our waste into biodegradable and the rest, because we don't recycle enough, because we don't process enough, we end up dumping mixed waste on landfill sites. I shall not say landfills because we do not develop scientific landfills, but you really have garbage hills on sites that are allocated for landfills. Now, that is a clearly unsustainable solution, and that is what I would say is the major worry I have about land as a challenge.
Well, thank you for drawing out that interdependency between urban development and the land use sector, which I think is a critical one, and also the issue of trying to get the prices for these things right, because the land use sector and the agricultural sector is not always a beacon for pricing things correctly. I would like to open it up now straight away for some questions from the room, because this is a relatively short session. So there's a gentleman at the back there. Oh, suddenly there's a lady with a purple scarf there, and then I saw you next, lady there. We'll take those 3 questions.
Thank you. My name's Scott Chaplow. I'm a Director of Evidence Measurement and Evaluation at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And once upon a time, I was a graduate student in geography, and with a focus on sustainable agriculture, as they called it back in the early 90s, looking at agroecology and kind of debunking the Green Revolution and the kind of the impact of technology with genetically modified crops that require high artificial yield and fertilizers, pesticides, not to mention the use of large mechanized machines and monocropping, which all leaves a very big carbon input, CO2 emissions. And it's interesting now to see, geez, I'm getting old, over 20 years later, with climate rising on the agenda, the attention that's being given to this. So I really want to commend Chatham House for putting this together, and the people that we have up there now bringing attention to this. My question is, and by the way, I like this metaphor with the tobacco industry. I think it's very apt. I can also think gun control in the States and the arms race is another comparison. My question is, in the area of climate, one of the Trojan arguments, if you want to call it that, kind of false arguments, is that people will, well, I guess it's not false, people will be losing jobs, but when you look at how many people will actually be using jobs going into using renewable energy versus those that will be gaining jobs, there's a lot of employment that would be coming from a more renewable approach. With regards to agriculture, a lot of the large-scale mechanized agriculture obviously reduces the number of people who are doing agriculture. A lot of agriculture that is more sustainable, using intercropping and so forth, has a higher requirement of labor. So my question to the panel is, to what degree do you see that and see that being leveraged as an argument? Thank you.
Thank you.
Bernice Lee from the Hoffman Center at Chatham House. Almost everything about food is political, is controversial, is emotional. And at the same time, if we are to make the shift that you guys suggest, we also have to tackle some quite deep-seated political economy interest, one of which is subsidies. So I just wanted to hear the panel reflect a little bit on how subsidies have got us to where we are, and how potentially, what are the areas we can look to tackling the question around subsidies, knowing how difficult it is to get rid of bad ones and perhaps easier to add good ones? So
$350 billion a year, opportunity or threat? And then next question here.
My name is Haula. I'm coming from Tunisia. I'm Chevening scholar studying MSc War on Psychiatry at King's College London. My question is about security implications. So the growing competition for land is also a competition to control water resources. So to what extent could this influence or spark regional conflicts? And can we witness later the water resources as a weapon of war?
Okay. Tim, do you want to take the question on subsidies to begin with, and then we'll go from there?
Okay, thanks for the question, Bernice. So as Rob said, at the moment we use about $590 billion worth of subsidies, and that is largely focused on increasing grain production around the world. And as I kind of mentioned in passing, the global food system is based on the promotion of grain as the most economically viable crop, because it's easy to dry, it's easy to transport, and so on. So 50% of our calories comes from rice, wheat, and maize. 3 crops provide 50% of our calories. If we repurpose that subsidy or at least some of that subsidies, we could level the playing field a bit and make it more economically viable to grow more fruit and vegetable, which is what we need from a nutrition and health perspective. But at the moment, those are not economically viable crops because they're more difficult to grow, they're more difficult to transport, they're more difficult to market, more difficult to make an international commodity crop. So part of the subsidy things that we could do would be to think about how we can use that to support more localized, because there'd have to be more localized supply chains delivering fruit and vegetables. And as with the renewable energy transition, the renewable energy took off, not because all of the subsidy came out of fossil fuel, but it took, what was 10% of the subsidy, something like that. 10% of fossil fuel subsidy was repurposed, and that allowed enough of a level playing field for things to take off. So the subsidy regime has been instrumental in getting us where we are, highly concentrated in space with the breadbasket regions, are highly concentrated in crops with the commodity crops, highly concentrated caloric diet, not nutritional diet. Subsidies have got us there, and subsidies can help us get out of there.
Great, thank you very much. The question about local level regional conflicts, Lisa, is this something that you've seen springing up with your work on investment treaties?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I think we've seen cases where, for example, in Colombia, they set aside an area as a natural reserve based on some domestic interest in doing that and for protection of biodiversity. And then after that decision locally was made, then the investor is using the investor-state dispute settlement, this delocalized mechanism, to challenge that decision. And so I think that's an example of how you can remove some of the kind of the domestic contestation over land use choices and decisions to protect the environment or promote investment in extractive industries, remove that decision or that conflict and take it to another form.
And Jimmy, one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of coverage of over the last couple of years are local level conflicts between pastoralists and sedentary farmers in the West Africa region over access to land and water resources. Is this a problem that you expect could grow as time passes?
It is giving us food for thoughts. Clearly, one of the most devastating events is the one that occurred in Nigeria, where about more than 100 people died. And so consequently, folks got together. The region had 2 big meetings and trying to look at this issue of access to land and pastoralism. Pastoralism is a system, a production system, as well as a way of life that has been practiced for a long period of time. Now, all of a sudden, we can sort of legislate to say, okay, no more pastoralism. So, and we have a project funded by the World Bank for pastoralism and implemented by 6 countries, mostly the Sahelian countries. But the thing is, the animals from Sahel move southward to the Benin, the Ivory Coast, and Togo, and so on. So basically what we're trying to do is, nowadays what we're trying to do is sitting down, engaging in a dialogue whereby, okay, what do we need to do with respect to, the pressure that's coming from, increased population, pastoralism, what have you. What systems do we need to really design so that we can all live in this together? And luckily there are some good progress that has been made. And I think folks have understood that it cannot be just pushed aside, but it needs to be addressed. And I think within the next couple of months, we should be able to come up with some good resolutions to some of those issues.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
And Olaf, what are your thoughts on the question about food system transformation and models that can create livelihood opportunities versus models that can cause people to lose their jobs and the politics of that? As a sort of a change agent on this agenda, is this something that you're thinking about actively?
Absolutely. I just want to say that Bernice is absolutely right about the political economy challenges in this space, and we will be coming out with a major landmark report together with the Lancet later this fall. a commission that has been hard at work for a couple of years to figure out what is a healthy diet from a sustainable food system, and we'll be proposing scientific targets and as well as other recommendations. And I'm sure things are going to get heated up when that is put forward. That's going to be at the global level, and one of the things that we want to work on going forward is precisely to engage at the country level in terms of, okay, what does this mean, this picture, global picture, mean in different country contexts, and recognizing that, for instance, a country like India is a very different starting point, different realities. How can we contextualize this in such a way that you can actually have a conversation even and start moving things forward? And we're very happy that we will be collaborating with Chatham House on an initiative to precisely translate the science into kind of political currency. We call it the Leaders for Tomorrow's Diet initiative, and this is actually really key. What the person who asked the question highlighted. There's no way we can move this kind of agenda forward without taking into full considerations potential winners and losers, and how do you actually make sure that where there are smallholder farmers or the urban poor, or large companies for that matter, that there is that you can actually point towards a pathway where there is enough critical mass, if you wish, on the winning side, that you can actually navigate that. There's no question that in any transformation there are winners and losers, but how can you, if at least you're able to point to a desired future for a majority of people, including that future isn't more boring and less tasty than the past, but the opposite, that a future of a more varied, more healthy, more sustainable diet is actually more interesting, more tasty, and something to look forward to, as opposed to kind of dressing in ashes and eating beans. That's not the point here.
Okay, I know Tim wanted to come on this, and then I'd like to come to you, Isha, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief intervention. As I mentioned, the externalized costs of the food system are perhaps 5 to 10 times greater than the entire agricultural economy. To make our system sustainable, we need to start internalizing those costs. So instead of the health system subsidizing our diet, and instead of the environment subsidizing our diet, we have to acknowledge the true cost of producing food. That means that the different sorts of food are going to have to be priced and valued differently, which implies that there will be a need for a greater rural economy because of more diversified agriculture, shorter supply chains, a whole range of different things. So there might be more employment in agriculture because we're moving away from the big ag monoculture sort of employment in agriculture. So there is lots of scope for production side improvement in livelihoods and more diversified rural economies. That leaves a really important political economy point, though, that if the price of food is going to rise, we need different sorts of social safety nets rather than subsidizing the price of food in the name of food poverty and making it too difficult to raise the price of food. We have to find better ways of supporting the poor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Isha. And as well, if you could address the question about water wars, given your point about water being a particularly strategic resource.
In the industrialized world, the whole agricultural economy has been driven by subsidies, and as you say, it's created the sort of problems. So when you solve it, you have to work out a different system, I understand. But when you look at developing countries, you look at a country like India, it is not just a question of giving these farmers some money and saying, now you change your cropping patterns. Because, these are people who are kind of rooted to their land, rooted to their way of thinking. I mentioned earlier on in Maharashtra, which is a highly water-stressed area, we are producing sugarcane. In Punjab, we are producing paddy. So I think in order to achieve, Ola, what you're saying, you will really need to bring a lot of funding to get people to change. And I think it needs to be done. So I'm just putting that tag on, because we have not given income subsidies for agricultural production in our countries. On water, you know, already we find that India is like a continent, and we have so many states, and different states are fighting each other for the same water resources when they share an aquifer. So we are already seeing that. Then in South Asia, India and Bangladesh are engaged in sort of, you know, let's put it politely, dialogue over water. So water is something which is not just now going to increase the possibility of conflict. If you go back into the history, water really has been the source of cross-border conflict. So we need to really develop a water diplomacy, develop an attitude towards water, which we are now beginning to develop towards the planet. And I think that's the only way.
Great, thank you. Let's take another round of questions. So there's a lady here, gentleman here, and a gentleman at the front there.
Carolina Closer, UNDP. My question is regarding the role of gender equality in this sector. What role do you see for that in the future, given that some studies say hunger could be reduced already nowadays by 150 million if women were given equal access to productive resources in farming, such as fertilizers, tools, and the high percentage of women being active in this sector?
Please, yep.
Hi, I am Nabojit De, and I'm a chief evening scholar from India. I'm doing my research from University of Sussex. I come from Jharkhand. Now, Jharkhand is rich in forest. It's rich in minerals, uranium, bauxite, copper, iron ore, whatever you call it, it's all coming from there. Now, the problem is that all these minerals are lying beneath forest. What Isa said was water. I would say it's not only water. In fact, the bigger problem is forest. The conflict which is going on in India, the left-wing extremism, it's all around, it's all inside those forests where the problem is. So my question is, and it's all because of industries are extracting minerals from these forest areas. The farmers who are tribal, they are being converted into laborers. They have gone into migration. Most of them are living in urban areas. So my question is that how can industries sustain themselves and not destroy the forest? Is it possible that forests cannot be destroyed, but still the industries can sustain themselves?
It might be interesting if we have any representatives from extractive industries or agribusiness in the audience. They may want to offer some thoughts on that question as well. And then gentleman here, yeah, thank you.
I'd like to, my name's John Rosario, and I'm a Chatham House member. I'd like to stay on the topic of water for a moment. 30 years ago, I did my baccalaureate thesis on water resources, and one of the solutions that I looked at in my research was desalinization of seawater. Back then, and we're talking late 1970s, very early 1980s, it wasn't very cost effective. I imagine with the passage of time, costs may have gone down. So I want to know from the panel if you see any future for that, particularly for India, but also the Middle East, where you raise the issue of conflict. And that's going to be a source of conflict in the Near East region down the road, I believe.
Good, so we got the question about desalination. I'd like to extend it as well, if people could think about whether or not there are truly transformational technologies that could kind of take all of these problems away, because certainly based on the sessions that we've had earlier in the day, there's an awful lot of change happening technologically, and I do wonder how many of these problems may actually just be solved by technology itself. Let's turn to the question about gender and women in agriculture, and particularly the access to technology, and I guess access to land as well, as a key determinant of agricultural productivity. Is this an issue that you've worked on in West Africa and the Sahel?
Yeah, the issue, you take women, you put them into small producers, you add to them men who are also on small holdings, and you have a convoluted series of problems. And so what has been happening, I think people are moving progressively toward, look, this is the decade of small farmers. Yes, you can produce in medium and large size farmers, but you cannot ignore them anymore. So we, with respect to SILS and the region as a whole, have begun to really understand that to move people out of poverty, keep them into sustainable production and better livelihood, the like of which will stop kids from going into the bush, becoming either bandits, terrorists, or going and falling in the sea. Critical approaches must be undertaken and applied. So there is movement toward, okay, we got it, we understand, there's technology, there is this urbanization, there is this land tenure issues and what have you. So actually there are opportunities that have been given to us, given the fact that yes, there are a lot of problems, but opportunities as well, because we are reclaiming land. We are saying 40 years ago we began looking at issues that face women. Today, roughly about the same issue, we say no more of that. If it's lack of access, if it's access to knowledge, transferring knowledge, lack of credit, there are some very critical opportunities that have been designed and implemented so that we really move people away from poverty. And it used to be just farmers, mothers and sisters and brothers and uncles and nephews in the farming system, still in subsistence farming. Now kids graduate with diplomas, they come into the system, no jobs, and that's what we're having this terrorism really taking roots in some of these areas. So in summary, because of these different threats and challenges, people have really begun to getting their hands around some of these multiple series of issues, and I think we're actually rolling out some good programs that focus specifically. And by the way, I need to maybe put in a plug for the Canadians. The Canadians are now saying, if gender, particularly women, are not part of your logic framework, then you get no funding. And so that has really also brought in some serious pressure, which is moving the lines a little bit. And so there is hope.
Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Lisa, do you have a view on this question about what industries should be doing differently to avoid conflict and?
Yeah, I mean, I do maybe on that, and also on the gender issue as well. I mean, in terms of industries, I almost think that instead of moving toward new technologies or new approaches, that there's so much information out there about how what we're doing with respect to environmental impact assessments and social and environmental impact assessments are really just not as much as we should be doing. We should be doing them earlier. We should be doing them more robustly. And I think focusing on those types of issues to understand the impacts in advance and have real meaningful options in terms of different mitigation strategies. Oftentimes they're done after the project has already been designed or after it's been approved. So it doesn't really leave enough options in terms of designing the project and identifying ways that you can mitigate impacts and try and harmonize these different competing uses of land, and also understanding the impacts on jobs and the local communities around the projects. And extractive industries, I mean, it's at the heart of so many conflicts around the world in terms of different ideas over who has the ability to decide how to use land and what benefits flow and to whom. Just on the gender issue, I think it's interesting because there's an increasing awareness of the impacts that free trade and movement of goods, services, and capital have on agricultural jobs. And so we saw that in the NAFTA, for example, so many of the sugar producers having to compete with the high fructose corn syrup industry in the US. And now that's been completely transformational in the agricultural economy of Mexico. So in Chile and Canada recently supplemented and revised their existing free trade agreement to add a gender chapter to look at implications of gender for the free trade agreement. And other free trade agreements, like the free trade agreement that was done in Africa, there was a human rights impact assessment that focused on agricultural sector. So I think there's movement in terms of understanding impacts, and until we understand really the impacts, we can't address them. So thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Isha, did you want to come in on one of those questions?
Yes. On the question of forests and industry, all I would say is that we have regulations in the country on the use of forest area and restrictions on that, but we don't have enforcement capacity. So that brings you back to the challenges of governance. On desalination, I think the country to look to really is Singapore, where the first thing that they tried, and I think it is the first thing any country should start with to address the water challenge, is really protect your surface water. Second, reclaim your wastewater. Third, they used high technology to develop new water. And finally, desalination. Now, in the order in which I have presented these, desalination is the most expensive alternative. Today, Japan and Singapore are using it. In some states in India, some coastal states, which really suffer from drought conditions, we have set up a few desalination plants, but they are economically not viable in most conditions, and we have not really covered the other three areas, the more conventional ways of addressing the problem. So my view on that would be we should do these first, and yes, of course, desalination offers an ultimate solution.
Okay, Tim and then Olaf, and then we're going to run till 10 past because we started 10 minutes late, and then we're going to stay put while we reorganize for the next session. So if you two are very brief, there may be opportunity for one very quick.
So just on the question of transformational technologies, I mean, desalination is obviously one, but the energy costs of pumping water a long way inland start becoming prohibitive, so you have to be quite coastal, really. More generally about transformational technologies, I think we're in the situation where we live in a finite world, and yet economists continue with this fantasy that the more efficient we become at using the finite world, the more we can stretch out resources forever and support infinite economic growth. We've got to face at some point over the next century that there are limits to growth from a natural resource perspective. And part of the reason that the land economy is such a market failure is because the real costs of using the land or using the water or extracting the minerals and chopping down the forests and the carbon costs that come from that are not incorporated into business models. So a lot of the future has got to be about internalizing externalities. And where will transformation happen? It will happen in a whole range of different things. One of the areas that might transform food is meditech. So with malnourishment in the sense of overconsumption of calories being the #1 global ill health driver these days, any medical technology that allows you to look at your watch and say, oh, I can't eat that biscuit because it's going to increase my chance of diabetes or something like that, is likely to shift diets, reduce waste, and a whole range of other things. So alternative proteins we're familiar with, lots of agro-tech that we're familiar with, but think outside the box because there's a whole lot of interesting technology which will help change our demand side and get away from this kind of concept that more is always better from consumption.
Olaf.
Yeah, you can also just look at what's happening as we speak when it comes to lab-grown and also plant-based meat substitutes. It's coming quite fast. Prices going down, and the taste is apparently now very comparable, or even some people say better than meat from animals. So then why keep on killing them, right? And so that could actually be quite a transition for the future. Now, very quickly on saltwater. I mean, I think it's important to state that a big part of the future solutions when it comes to how we manage land is actually how we manage oceans, and how we extract protein from the oceans. Of course, in order to do that sustainably, we have to come up with much better ways of managing and governing oceans, which means a new kind of collaborative stewardship model for them. But without cracking that huge nut of the oceans, we won't be able to solve the problems when it comes to food security for humanity. So oceans, land, very much linked together.
Okay, let's just do a quick experiment with the audience. If you can put your hand up if you'd be happy eating a laboratory-grown burger. Lab-grown burger. Wood. Lab-grown. Okay, wood. And how many people would be comfortable with a sin tax on meat? Wow, okay, that's an improvement since the last time I asked that question at the conference. Okay, we've got time for one last question, and it needs to be a brief one. The gentleman there was the first to get his hand up.
Hi, I'm Edward Knudsen from the US program at Chatham House, primarily for Lisa. You mentioned the differences between the investor-state dispute settlement system and that of the international trading system. With regards to efficient land use, do you think that a multilateral investment framework akin to that of trade is better, or do you think primarily the bilateral investment system works well?
I think overall I'm a bit hesitant about deeper rules on international investment because they are so geared toward behind the border type measures and regulatory measures, where I think we need more innovation and experimentation there. So I'm nervous about deeper rules on investment protection at this context. I think we need to have more policy space for enabling states to take measures that they think will address some of these challenges. I mean, if we think about taxes, removing subsidies, these are all types of measures that are often challenged in investor-state dispute settlement. So I would put a pause on all of that at the moment.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to close this session there. I'm going to ask people to stay put while we get ready for the next session. I mean, I think that one of the key takeaways for me from this conversation actually was that there is a non-trivial risk of conflict on the horizon with these mounting pressures on land, whether that is a local level or a larger strategic level. But there are solutions that are available, whether they're on the production side of things, the demand side of things, technology, governance, different business models. But it's probably going to require us pulling all the levers pretty much as hard as we can if we're going to avoid the crunch that's potentially coming. So I'd like to thank our panel for an excellent discussion. And yeah, thank you all very much. Get ready for the next session. Thank you.